If you are struggling to revise the 15 power and conflict poems from the poetry anthology, then this video is for you. I know it can seem very overwhelming to try and revise 15 poems, and I don't expect you to learn every single one of them, but if you want a recap of the 15 poems, what I have done here in this resource, which I am going to be uploading to my TS shop for free for you guys to help you revise from, is I've condensed the key information from each poem, the key contextual information from each poem, key quotations, which you will see bolded and underlined in the poem, and you'll notice that I've only put very short quotations in to make them nice and easy to remember, and there are also techniques in these summaries. So that information has all been condensed here for you to help you revise and help you feel less stressed about that exam. So in this video, I'm going to go through each of these summaries and explain them as I go. And then, as I said, that resource will be available for you on my TS shop, which will be completely free. So, starting with Ozymandias, the poem takes the form of a sonnet told from the perspective of a nameless speaker who met a traveller from an antique land. This is important because we are getting the information third hand, which adds to the insignificance of a ruler obsessed with immortalising himself in physical form. Ozymandias' attempts were futile, as the statue is now merely a colossal wreck. The traveller describes the shattered visage and trunkless legs of the destroyed statue of Ramesses II, as well as exposing the ruthless nature of the pharaoh. Shelley addresses corruption and hypocrisy when he speaks of the hand that mocked and the heart that fed. This could be seen as a critique of the church who exploited young children for personal profit. Think about chimney sweepers. A lot of the time, the church were complicit in that industry and profiting from it. A further critique of religion comes when Ozymandias arrogantly declares himself King of Kings, a biblical allusion positioning himself as God, because of course the King of Kings is God. He then goes one step further, directly challenging God when he commands, "Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." The hint that Ozymandias is talking to God himself directly is capitalized in the word mighty. By the end of the poem, we learn that nature has triumphed over man as it has caused the statue's decay. All that remains is the lone and level sands which stretch far away. So that is Ozymandias. Moving on to London. The poem is written in quatrains to reflect the rigid control exercised by the government over people at the time. The poem is told from the perspective of a speaker, most likely Blake himself, wandering through the chartered streets and seeing the chartered Thames. The chartered Thames is oxymoronic as it is impossible to regulate a river, and is incidentally one of the longest lines of the poem, perhaps reflecting nature's power over humans. On his stroll through the city, Blake notes the expressions of those he sees contain marks of weakness and marks of woe. The repetition of the noun marks implies that they have been permanently affected by oppression. This idea is continued when he considers the metaphorical mind-forged manacles, reflecting how people have been conditioned and brainwashed by the government. Blake speaks of the soldier's cry resulting in blood running down palace walls, which hints at his hope there might be a revolution in England as there was in France. Blake describes the blackening church. Think about the word blackening and the connotations of that. We would usually associate black with something evil and the church with white, which obviously symbolizes like goodness and positivity, but it's the blackening church with that present participle blackening, indicating that it is getting worse. So that might reflect the ongoing corrupt activities which he hopes to see an end to. By the end of the poem, Blake cautions readers on the consequences of the amoral behaviour of Londoners, amoral meaning without morals. The plagues Blake mentions refer both to the literal spread of, more likely than not, sexually transmitted diseases and God's wrath and punishment if they do not change their behaviour. Extract from the prelude. This is one that a lot of students struggle with, but it's actually very, very straightforward. So the poem is told from the perspective of Wordsworth himself, written in blank verse, and is an extract from a much larger autobiographical epic poem to reflect the power of nature. It is a Bildungsroman. That is a German borrow word, which means a coming-of-age story. And one summer evening, led by her, Wordsworth ventures out and steals a boat as an act of stealth and troubled pleasure, suggesting he knew he shouldn't be doing it. As he sets off in the boat, heaving through the water like a swan, he encounters a mountain which is described as a huge peak, black and huge, which portrays the sublimity of nature due to the size of the mountain. So the sublimity of nature is this idea that nature is both beautiful and awe-inspiring, but at the same time terrifying. And then the verb heaving, to juxtapose the swan's graceful movements, further reinforces that he is disrupting nature. The mountain is personified as it upreared its head, which is when the boy really started to feel troubled and afraid as he regretted stealing the boat. It is almost it almost felt as if the mountain strode after him. As the boy was so frightened, he turned around to try to get back with trembling oars and hide in the covert of the willow tree. It's like the safety of the willow tree. Due to the power of nature, here hung a darkness over the boy, which plagued him, as he describes, a trouble to his dreams. So by the end, owing to the power of nature, his experience in seeing the mountain, there sort of hung a darkness over him, which then plagued him for days to come. Next, we have My Last Duchess. Now, this came up last year, and it is a relatively tricky poem, but the storyline of the poem is straightforward. So the poem is a dramatic monologue told from the perspective of an arrogant duke in Italy who is giving a tour of his home to an envoy sent by the father of a prospective new wife. His last duchess's fate is unclear at first. All we know is that he keeps a painting of her behind a curtain. Even in death, he controls her. The Duke directs the attention of his guests towards the painting of his wife, looking as if she were alive. The Duke sees her positive aura as negative, criticising the fact that she smiled and thanked others. He uses the metaphor spot of joy to describe her happiness, with the noun spot having negative connotations of something to be rid of. The Duke also says that he gave commands and all smiles stopped together. These sinister euphemistic phrases are understood by the reader as the Duke having killed her. A euphemistic phrase is a phrase that talks about something indirectly. So he doesn't actually say openly that he killed her, but he says all smiles stopped together. After this stream of consciousness, that's kind of him stopping without pausing, without letting anyone else speak, in which he did not let the visitor say one word, the Duke shows off another piece of art, commanding the envoy to notice Neptune taming a seahorse. The sculpture is symbolic of the Duke's desire for dominion over a subordinate wife, as Neptune is obviously god of the sea, and so he uses this piece of artwork to reflect his own desire to be all-powerful and all-controlling. You could use the word omnipotent, which means all-powerful. Next up, we have Storm on the Island. The poem is told from the perspective of a nameless speaker, perhaps Heaney himself having lived in a rural existence. It is written in blank verse, and its lack of organisation is reflective of both the setting, an island, and the disorder of a storm. The poem is written in the first person, but reveals that the experience is a shared one when he says, "We build our houses squat." Heaney's use of juxtaposition, exploding comfortably to illustrate the idea that the events during and in preparation for the storm are part of daily life. The first 8 letters of the poem's title, Stormont, are actually the name of the Parliament buildings in Northern Ireland, and the line "tamed cat turned savage" hint at the fact that the poem is likely a commentary on the troubles in Ireland. The tamed cats turned savage is perhaps in reference to civilians who became embroiled in civic unrest. If you want more information on the troubles in Ireland, then you can have a look at my context sheet, which is also available to download for free on the My TAS shop. With this in mind, we then come to understand the poem's title and the storm as being a metaphor for an actual war. To reinforce this idea, Heaney uses warlike terminology, creating a semantic field. Bombarded, blast, pummels, which suggests that nature is more powerful than mankind and their creation of weapons. When Heaney uses the oxymoronic tragic chorus, it could be a comment on how, much like a chorus in a song, the storm and fighting in Ireland will be perpetual, which is also reflected through the sustained enjambment throughout the poem. He concludes that there is a huge nothing they fear, perhaps a comment about the futility of war, so the pointlessness of war. Exposure. The poem is told from the perspective of Owen himself on the battlefield facing the merciless iced east winds. Here, nature is personified to seem as if it is attacking the soldiers, and from the outset, we understand that the real enemy in World War I was the elements and the horrific conditions in the trenches. And this reflects the power of nature. Owen talks of how their collective brains ache, highlighting the weariness of soldiers and the mental trauma of war. It also vividly reveals how it was a mutual pain collectively experienced. Owen asks himself rhetorical questions about the futilities, that's the pointlessness, again, of war, such as, what are we doing here? Which is answered later on, whilst he wonders if there is any value in his suffering. The short declarative phrase, "but nothing happens," is repeated 3 times throughout the poem, illustrating the monotony of war. The wind tugging on the wire is a reminder of twitching agonies of men amongst its brambles, exposing the horrific scenes the men have witnessed. The simile highlights the shell shock, as it was known then, and PTSD experienced by Owen and his fellow soldiers. The poem reaches its bleak and poignant means sad, conclusion, with Owen commenting that love of God seems dying, as their literal death is alluded to through the suggestion that the frost will fasten on them that night. The Charge of the Light Brigade. The poem is told from the perspective of a nameless speaker recounting the events of the tragedy of the Light Brigade. It is told in 6 stanzas reflecting the 600 soldiers, and the regimented form reflects the military. It begins with the soldiers being commanded to keep going half a league onwards. The repetition reveals that they had no choice but to obey. This is reinforced through the anaphora, theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die, reflecting that they were acting blindly. They were given orders to charge for the guns and are essentially sent to their deaths as their weaponry paled in comparison. That means it was nothing in comparison to the opposition's. The refrains Valley of Death and Mouth of Hell are repeated throughout as an attempt by Tennyson to empathise with the plight of the men. In the poem's climactic scene, we see the men surrounded by cannons to the right of them, cannons to the left of them, and cannons in front of them, as they were stormed at. The men stood no chance as they were plunged in battery smoke, meaning they were submerged in the opposition's cannons smoke, with only sabres to defend themselves. The poem is a subtle critique of the army, with the verbs blundered and wondered implying that people were sceptical about how such an event occurred. Tennyson concludes the poem with an imperative to honour the Light Brigade and ends by immortalising their efforts as noble in the poem. Bayonet Charge. The poem is written in the third person about a nameless soldier, which is a deliberate ploy by Hughes to expose how war strips people of their identities. The poem begins in medias res, so in the middle of the action, and describes the soldier's experience of stumbling across no man's land during World War I. The soldier's inexperience is evident through the verbs stumbling and lugged, as he is unfamiliar with conflict and weaponry. His disorientation is also made explicit through the verb dazzled and the abstract noun bewilderment, as he struggles to make sense of the chaos around him. The illustrative cold clockwork suggests the erasure of his humanity, as he has become a cog in a larger machine, and it is clear he has lost sight of his reason for fighting when it says king, honour, human dignity, etc. The adverb etc. reveals his disillusionment and disconnect with his purpose and identity. As the poem reaches its conclusion, the speaker explores the psychological effects of war with his terror's touchy dynamite and highlights the sense of alienation and detachment that can come from participating in such brutal conflict. Poppies. So, Poppies is told from the perspective of a mother sending her son off to war. The mother is tormented by the loss of innocence signalled by her son's departure and reminisces about this. Her maternal nature is highlighted through the small details of her rounding up as many white cat hairs as she could and resisting the impulse to run her fingers through the gelled blackthorns of his hair. The blackthorns could be seen as a biblical allusion, as Jesus wore a crown of thorns on the cross, so perhaps she sees her son as a sacrificial offering to the world. She describes the world overflowing like a treasure chest, understanding that he is growing up and must pursue the myriad, that means a large number, of opportunities now open to him. Although the fate of her son is unknown, by the end of the poem it could be read as a critique of the fact his enrolment in the army and possible death closed avenues to him. She describes her son as intoxicated, and this adjective suggests that he has been lured in by the army and is not of sound mind to make a decision. There is a clear semantic field of war through the poem, with lexical choices such as blockade, bandage and reinforcements utilised to reflect the sense that the mother is battling with her desire for her son not to leave for war. The simile of the wishbone is used alongside the symbolism of the dove to reflect her hope her son is alive, and she reminisces about, that means sort of reflects on and thinks about his playground voice catching on the wind, so his innocence in childhood and youth. Whilst he may be literally gone from her life, his memory is etched into her mind. War Photographer. The poem is written in the third person as a deliberate narrative decision by Duffy to further reinforce that no one understands the vocation of a war photographer. Duffy herself was friends with many war photographers and wanted to highlight, much like in Remains, that the horrors of war transcend, that means goes beyond the battlefields themselves. The war photographer has no name, indicating the idea that that the role stripped him of his identity. The dark room is a metaphor for his thoughts, and the mental trauma a war photographer endures is further reinforced through the solutions slopping because of hands that tremble, likely due to PTSD. This may have been inspired by the suicide of Kevin Carter as a result of his work as a war photographer. For more information on this, you can have a look at my poetry context sheet. And there is a sense of disconnect between the photographer and the real world when he seems to speak quite scathingly, that's very critical, of ordinary pain and the prick of the reader's eyeballs, as if they are so desensitized to war that we are only momentarily sad and do not care. The poem also explores the tension between the photographer's duty to document the reality of war, when he says do what someone must, and his own emotional response. Although by the end, the adverb impassively suggests that he has conditioned himself to be desensitized to the human cost of conflict. Remains is told from the perspective of a soldier, most likely Guardsman Tromans. Google him and watch his account of the events. That is available on YouTube, and it's very chilling and poignant. As I said before, poignant is like sad, heartbreaking. The title is polysemous, indicating both physical remains and the remains of a memory. This links to the overarching theme of PTSD and that the effects of war transcend physical violence. The casual opening on another occasion implies that this is one of a number of similar events. This is reinforced through the colloquial language tackle, legs it, tosses, guts and carted in relation to the death of a civilian suspected of looting, exposing the nonplussed attitude to the loss of human life in war. The soldier begins to question his motives in the somewhat oxymoronic, probably armed, possibly not, where the certainty dwindles across a few words. The polysyndeton, that's what a list that is joined with ands or other conjunctions. The polysyndeton, myself and somebody else is used to absolve him of blame. The caesura in the line, end of story, except not really, also acts as a volta in the poem. So that's like a turning point within the poem, where we come to understand the mental impact the event has had on him. Human life is further reduced to a blood shadow and something he wishes to flush out, but the inescapability of the memory is seen through the verbs burst, sleep, dream, and dug in. The poem's conclusive colloquial line, his bloody life in my bloody hands, reveals the mental torment and guilt of the soldier. The Emigra. The poem is told from the perspective of a displaced person who romanticizes and idealizes the war-torn place where she was born. Neither the city nor the country is ever named, and this lack of specific detail seems intentional. It is as if Rumens wants her poem to be relevant to as many people who have left their homelands as possible. The spelling of the title, Emigra, is a feminine form, suggesting the speaker is female, perhaps even someone young, through the multiple images of childhood, such as hollow doll, paper plane, and image of the country being almost like a pet. The poem's fairy tale-like opening, there once was a country, possibly suggests the romanticized version of the place only ever existed in the emigra's imagination. Rumen suggests that the city and country may now be at war or sick with tyrants who have banned the language the speaker once knew. Despite this, the speaker is branded by sunlight, with the verb branded suggesting that she will always hold on to the idealized version of her home country. This is reinforced through the repetition of the possessive my city. This reveals the power that places can have, even over people who have left them with no passport or no way back. Tissue, one that I know a lot of people are worried about, but let's go into it and get some ideas in case it comes up in the exam. The poem is told from the perspective of a nameless speaker reflecting on the power and significance we as humans ascribe to particular objects. Buildings, books, material objects, paper. The speaker seems critical of the fact that in attempting to create permanent things, we forget about the power of living tissue, of actually being alive, the power of humans. With this in mind, we come to understand the polysemous nature of the poem's title, polysemous meaning having two or more meanings. Tissue as an extended metaphor for life. The poem is written in quatrains, perhaps reflecting the predictability and repetitive nature of human behaviour throughout history, always fixated on immortalising ourselves in physical form. The speaker considers how paper can alter things. The power of material objects and the way money controls our lives is explored through the simile. Fine slips from grocery shops might fly our lives like paper kites. In the final stages of the poem links the idea of a building being made from paper to human skin, using the words living tissue and then your skin. This is quite a complex idea and the meaning is open to interpretation. She may be suggesting that the significance of human life will outlast the records we make of it on paper or in buildings. There is also a sense of the fragility of human life and the fact that not everything can last. The insignificance and impotence of humans in the face of nature times power is explored through the metaphor. With living tissue, we raise a structure never meant to last. The structure made with living tissue is, of course, the human body. Although we convince ourselves it will last forever, we will all eventually die. Kamakazi. The poem is told from the perspective of a woman recalling her father's failure as a kamikaze pilot and the repercussions. Her father embarked at sunrise and had obviously been conditioned to be a human weapon, as she describes his shaven head, shaven to remove any trace of his former identity, and the fact that his head is full of powerful incantations. However, her father was tempted by life below as he made his one-way journey into history. The flag making a figure of 8 creates an image of the infinity symbol, suggesting he is trapped by his destiny. The kamikaze pilot is never referred to by name and only ever with pronouns, as the shame of not completing the mission has stripped him of his identity further. His family treated him as though he no longer existed after he returned, having failed to complete the mission. The speaker comments that only the children, too young to understand what was going on, chatted and laughed as he was shunned by everyone else. As they grew older, they learned to be silent. The verb learned hints that they too learned to conform to societal expectations with regard to honour. The poem ends with the speaker pondering the question, which had been the better way to die? In the aircraft, on his suicide mission, or alone and ostracised for the remainder of his days. And then finally, we have Checking Out Me History. The poem is told from the perspective of Agard himself, and its verses are a combination of fragmented thoughts reflecting his lack of knowledge about his own history and longer, more melodic sections where he reels off irrelevant information retained from his British curriculum education, such as nursery rhymes. Agard says, "Dem tell me," to reflect his disregard for his teachers. He deliberately uses the patois to show his pride in his Caribbean culture, although he feels he has been bandaged up from and blinded to his own history and identity. Agard says 1066 and all that, 1066 being the date of the Battle of Hastings, to suggest that this is superfluous and pointless information to him, a proud Guyanese man. The use of "and all that" displays his disregard and resentment for the education he has received and how irrelevant it is to him. Agard also creates a semantic field of light, sunrise, healing star, beacon, and firewoman when speaking about Black history, which portrays how significant and important these Black figures from history are. You may want to think of the connotations of sunlight, star, beacon, and fire. So sunrise, new dawn, hope, possibility. A star often has a sort of a symbol of something that we might make a wish upon, or again, hope. A beacon of hope, and fire is something very powerful. So he is associating all these powerful images with these significant figures from Black history. Agard also juxtaposes the names Florence Nightingale and Mary C. Cole. He talks about how both were nurses, yet he was only ever taught to know about Florence Nightingale's achievements, a white nurse in the Crimean War. This juxtaposition can reflect how schools only ever teach students about Britain's notable figures instead of other figures who are just as important. By the end of the poem, Agard concludes that he must check out his own history, implying it is something he is doing for the first time. And he talks of carving out his identity, the verb carving implying that this will take effort given his cultural displacement. So there you have it, all 15 poems. I hope that was useful and a relatively quick summary of the entire Power and Conflict Poetry Anthology. As I said, this resource is available to download for free. There is also a resource with a free resource with the key quotations and also the context for each poem. So go and check those out. And as I said, I will put a link to those videos in the description of this video, to those resources in the description of this video, and make sure that you subscribe to my channel because I will be posting more resources and information like this to help you with those exams.